Hi, this is Vince House. Welcome to the Aereco podcast.
Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of this Retrofit at Scale podcast. If you haven't heard the first part, I would suggest that you go back and have a listen to that. It's been fascinating listening to my guests in that first episode, and here is part 2 where we continue that journey. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did.
Things. Well, I was really disappointed recently when we were looking at how retrofit prices have gone during the course of SHDF Wave 1.
Yep.
And what we've been getting is tenders that are 50 to 100% higher than the original prices that went in the Wave 1 bids.
Wow.
And when you look at it, that's because there's loads of work out there, everybody all at once in response to SHDF is asking for the same stuff from a very limited number of suppliers.
Yeah.
And they can pick and choose which jobs they want to do, and they're busy anyway. So if extra stuff turns up, you price it high because you're not sure you can resource it, and you want to be sure that if you do get it, there's going to be something in it. But we're putting the installers in an impossible situation.
Yes.
And there's twofold to that, because you're right. I mean, material alone, the prices have gone up by around 30% on virtually all materials, certainly insulation materials, since the demonstrator phase, and then to when Wave 1 bids were written to when Wave 1 work actually started, the price increases have shot up. But there is also this supply and demand issue where, as an installer, we can, to a degree, some of us cherry pick the projects that we want to work on. But then we've also had scenarios where we've priced work at the bid stage, projects come to fruition, costs have gone up, and then we've had one scenario where all works have then been stopped because the client can't afford the increased prices or thinks they're unjust. They're then bringing in a third party, an independent consultant, to come and review all of the costs, which they have to pay for, which takes 4 to 6 weeks of everybody stopping work and downing tools at the height of when work should be delivered, to then be told, oh yes, the prices that you're being given are completely competitive and crack on. So more money has been wasted, more time has been lost. And going back to, I think, one of Alex's very early comments, neither of which we can spare. There is no spare money and there is no spare time.
Yeah.
So as a result, as contractors, we're saying, well, we've now got to, when we're writing the Wave 2 bids, we need to be looking at the likelihood of price increases over the next 1 and 2 years and factoring that in. And as a result, maybe it's skewing the current figures, but it will balance out by the end of the programme. And it's a really tricky way to work, because you've got clients that are basing their bids fully on grants and pricing right now, but things change all of the time. And because the grants are relative to if it's a D or an E rated EPC or an F, the lower the rating, the slightly higher grant with the SHDF they're getting, and they're choosing their worst first stock, which they absolutely should be. And going back to your earlier point, Peter, half of that stock might not be suitable for the work that they thought it was going to be suitable for. Yeah. And therefore the figures that were put in are wrong from the offset. And that's why we are pushing, like you've said, we're pushing to go out and choose that stock first, not just from a database, not just from a portal of really out of date information, but actually getting out there, looking at these properties, even if it's just a light touch survey to start with, so that actually when they're putting in a bid for a 2-year programme for potentially millions of pounds worth of work, it's actually deliverable and it doesn't have to be changed within a few weeks of the project starting.
Yeah, well, we have a good example of that with a London borough that's got a Wave 1 grant that they haven't started yet, something that you mentioned earlier, Danielle, and it's got to be delivered by the end of next March, and we're just starting the surveys for them. But what we've found is that there are things built into the process that they hadn't allowed for, like they get refusals from lots of people to even do the surveys, let alone do the retrofit. So we're actually inviting over 1,000 households to have their homes surveyed in order to get 267, which is what we need for the grant. So we've got to do sort of 700 and something more surveys, or at least attempt to do them, than we need to do, just to make sure that, because we'll also, once we do the surveys, we'll discover that some of them aren't suitable.
Yep.
And so the dropout rate for a house along the way is quite high. And certainly in people who have done their wave ones, the amount of money that's been returned, or the number of projects which have changed the houses that they're focusing on, or are doing different things from what they expected to the houses, and having to have dialogues with the monitoring officers, is quite large, which kind of showed that we didn't really all know what we were doing at the beginning of wave one.
Yeah, and on top of that, the other problem is planning applications.
Yeah.
Which is infuriating. And again, it goes back to this point of so many different departments within a council not talking to each other. So we've got one arm of the council saying, please improve our stock. We're going out, we're surveying, we're doing our retrofit assessments, we're putting in planning applications where we feel they're viable, because there's already properties within a street that have been insulated. So the existing street scene is no more. We're confident the planning will be accepted. We put that in, we go through that long process, we wait 12 weeks and the job's rejected. And then you've got the council then infighting about, why are we rejecting something that you let us do the neighbouring property 3 years ago? Yeah. And there's no conversation internally to be had. We're going through appeals. And again, it's more time and more money being wasted, both of which there aren't enough of in the first place. And how do we fix that? It's crazy to me that we have to go through that process. We totally, as you mentioned, hybrid systems all the time, especially where we do a lot of work in East London. Absolutely, the fronts of the properties have got to be protected. They've got to, that integrity of those streets needs to be maintained. But we know that. We've been around long enough, as have most of the contractors working in these areas, to know what is suitable and what is not suitable. So then to wait 3 months to be told we're still not going to let you do it, again, it's just further reducing the works that the properties that can be improved. And it's frustrating and time consuming.
Yeah, and I think there's also the whole thing about lots of local authorities, planning authorities, refuse to recognise the permitted development order, which supports EWI and solar on the roof. And now they're starting to issue Article 4 directives to block the permitted development orders, because they don't want us to do that stuff. And I think you're right. It's not as if we don't know where would be insensitive and inappropriate places to do it and where would be good places. They're just taking quite crude, quite blunt tools to the process to try and stop it. And you're quite right. They have to start talking to their colleagues about what the objectives here are.
Yeah, and is that going to happen overnight? Absolutely not, because we've been battling it for years, and I think we will continue to battle it. But all it does is it just keeps reducing the stock that can be treated, because you end up just having to take, in the same breath, you have to take a crude response to it and say, right, anything that might need planning applications, we're just walking away from. And that's not right from a moral point of view for the residents that are living in those properties and are just as likely to be in fuel poverty than somebody else.
Yeah.
But it's also a really sort of nonsensical approach when you're trying to do an area-based scheme and work through stock in a logistic fashion.
Yeah.
Because at some point in the future it will get allowed, and then you're going backwards and you're working backwards in these areas. And East London, as an example, much like West London and London in general, to be honest, they're difficult areas to deliver. Parking is an absolute nightmare. You've got congestion zones, you've got ULEZ, you've got all of these different factors. You can't use public transport if you're a contractor, because you simply can't take your tools and your material on the train. So you're reliant on the road networks. Traffic is hideous in the city centre. So there's so many things pushing people away, and I think this is another issue that's going to happen, is we're going to find that within this cherry picking process, people will say London's too difficult, so we steer clear of London, or we price it too high. And it's, again, nonsensical to me, and we've got to try and make these processes simpler to get people into these difficult areas.
Well, Well, that's exactly what we've been trying to do in Savills to streamline the processes. But you're absolutely right. We're finding that city centre stocks are almost impossible to do in an efficient way. There's it's not just all those issues, but also the fact that a significant proportion of the housing is leaseholders who you've got to negotiate with individually, and you might not get past. And so you can't sort of roll out the program street by street anymore. It's much more complicated than that. And I don't know. I'm almost inclined to not do stuff in city centres and to say we'll do the suburbs because that's a bit more homogenous. But city centres is too difficult. But actually, that's where the worst stuff is.
Yeah.
And
actually, we want to be encouraging people to live in cities in general, because higher density homes and blocks of flats tend to be more energy efficient than suburbia. So it's daft. And just to sort of add to Danielle's sort of point about planning, just going back to that very briefly, there was an example where there was a pretty plain little bungalows with horrible bay window details, and the much cheaper version of doing it would just get rid of the little bay window and put EWI, because it would just be much more effective. And it was, the planners were like, oh no, it'll change the aesthetic. And I was like, well, it's not exactly a UNESCO World Heritage site, is it? It's a bungalow in Wisbeach, for heaven's sake. And the extra cost per bungalow was £5,000 for this one window detail that you could have eliminated. If you've got 100,000 of those, suddenly it's sort of really big money. And it's that level of daftness, and in planners in general, bless them, probably, I don't know if they're lobotomized as part of the course, I don't know, but it's just, what's the thing? Locally, we have a thing with plastic chimneys on new houses. So if you want to build a new house, you've got to make it look like it's got a chimney. So you spend 1,500 quid on a fiberglass chimney that you plonk on the roof. Then actually becomes a health and safety issue, because under CDM, you've now introduced something that needs maintaining. And it's just bonkers. It was just, don't get me started. I could go for a week. We could divert this podcast into a planning hate fest, and I'm going to resist the temptation.
Let's. I mean, it's interesting that we're having a kind of collective whinge here, which I'm
are there really positives?
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, maybe Vince would like us to produce some successes.
I'm sure there's a positive spin in there. I mean, it's right to identify the issues, and let's face it, retrofit's not easy at scale. It's really difficult. I mean, I'd actually like to ask, I think both Danielle and Alex, firstly, because you both worked on the project with Clarion in Kent. What I suppose what did you learn from that? Because that was one of the first demonstrator projects, wasn't it? And that was it's been hailed, I believe, as a successful project. There's still a lot that haven't been signed off, as I understand it. And I'd like to understand why you think that was successful, and I can touch on. Well, I've got my own views on why I think it's successful, but I'd love to hear it from you guys, actually, because I'm sure other people would like to hear.
Well, ladies first, I think.
Thanks, Alex. I mean, from my perspective, an awful lot of front end work went into that project. We, even writing the bid for months and months, there was a large team of people from Clarion, from United Living, from Equans, Alex, myself. It was a big team of people working together to finite a project. Once the bid was successful, that same team worked tirelessly, to be honest. There was a lot of meetings and a lot of hours put into it before we even came close to being on site, to ensure that when we did start, we started knowing exactly what we were dealing with. We had already identified the properties. They'd all had their retrofit assessments. We'd done things the right way, in my opinion. And what this highlighted, something that I was then feeding back to Bays, was it just emphasised the fact that you cannot roll these out in 1 year waves, because 6 months of that wave, you are doing the design, all of the front end stuff, all of the talking, the meetings, the researching, the testing products, having products, bespoke products made to try and profile things. And then you've got 6 months of the year, which includes winter, to deliver the project. It simply doesn't work.
Agreed.
On a 2-year project, that's achievable. You can spend that first 6 months if you need to design in, and then you've got 18 months to deliver the work, and that makes it much more palatable and much more feasible to deliver. So for me, I think that the big success was the front end work that went into it. There was a large team of people all coming from different angles inputting into it.
Yep.
And it allowed us to make a lot of the mistakes online before we even got to site. And I think that was something that we've then been able to roll out to wave 1, and I've certainly rolled out on other SHDF projects that I'm working on.
Yep.
is to make the mistakes before you get to site.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think we're not out of that wood yet, though, Danielle. You know, if you look at the program for SHDF phase 2, wave 2, it's really pushing us to do the work in the winter, because, you know, they're going to give the decisions out in January. We'll spend the time doing all the designs and assessments that the people who are less well prepared through the spring and summer, and then we'll end up on site in the autumn and through the following winter. So, and we said that to Bays. We said it's not just about the length of the program; it's about where it's located in relation to the seasons. But I don't think
I made that
quite
exact
get that.
point.
Yeah, well, I don't think
I
got
made that exact point with them, that there's no point announcing successes in October, November, December. They should be telling people, in my opinion, it needs to be all refigured to match the industry. But the problem is they don't fully understand the grassroots level of work that goes into it. But your point earlier that you made hopefully will alleviate that, in that you can start doing that front end work before you're successful, at risk, of course. But then you can get it back paid, essentially. I think that will help. And certainly something that I'm seeing with some of my other clients is they are doing that. They're having their, even if it's just their EPCs done because they need them anyway, they're throwing their budgets at getting EPCs done for everything that are up to date, rather than relying on one that's 9 years old. And they've got no record if they've put new windows in or if they've changed the heating. So we're doing all of that now, which is enabling us to sort of design a mini program ready for when they are successful as to what ones we target for what.
I think one of the key things I'd like to add to what Danielle said in terms of why was it successful, I think it was partly client led, but I think it was just luck, actually. In part, there wasn't much in the way of adversarial people involved in the project. We all kind of realized that we had a limited amount of time to try and get the project done, and that the only way that we were ever going to be successful was to actually try and pull together and work as a team. And I genuinely, out of all the projects, and I've been involved with some fairly interesting projects over the years, that was probably the most cohesive, the most collaborative team on a construction project that I've ever worked with. As I said, I think partly it's luck, and I guess partly the nature of the contracts that are written between the housing association and its supply chain probably helped with that, in terms of trying to label it as a partnership. But that was a key sort of success, really. It was just that everybody wanted to get it right and try their best to deliver. So that made a big difference. It was, for me, the other thing I sort of found quite interesting was, in many ways, the client is just as stretched for labour and resources and knowledge and technical expertise as perhaps the supply chain is in certain respects. So there was definitely an education of the client as to, at local level, as to what is required in terms of trying to deliver a decent retrofit. And I think there's probably almost definitely an opportunity to go back to the good old days of sort of a clerk of works within these organisations that then perhaps shares those expertise with the client side team in terms of their local officers and bits and pieces. I think there's a real opportunity to you kind of build on what's been done. But it was certainly a really good project, as I say, in terms of collaboration and also. I think it was one of the first times that I've seen a project where we were involved a lot with manufacturers, and people don't realise that manufacturers often have got quite good expertise of how their products will or won't perform. and actually they're quite happy to be engaged. They would rather turn up before a job goes wrong and try and kind of offer the right products and the right solutions than trying to sort out the SH1T that happens after, once it's been installed wrong. And it's a huge advantage, trying to do it that way around. And so I just think it was great just to try and get everybody. And I guess the pandemic helped in that we were all forced to be online, all stuck at home in our sheds and garages and all the rest of it. And so we were all gathered virtually together. It was lots and lots of meetings, for which I apologise for, Danielle. But hopefully it did make sense to try and get the design as nailed down and get it absolutely as good as we could before we arrived on site. And there's still, the first 2 houses that we looked at, we still learnt a lot from doing those as a pilot that we then ran out, across the rest of the project. So, and I did like the idea that Base had in mind of trying to sort of do the lessons learned. I'm not quite sure how well they're publicised, any of the sort of Base stuff. Is it just disappearing into an information black hole, or is it getting shared back out, all the learnings that the various teams have learned over the last couple of years?
Well, surprisingly enough, they've appointed consultants to evaluate the program and produce a report. But I think it's going to take about 6 months, and the consultants, as far as I can see, have zero retrofit experience.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, really helpful. So I'm not holding out much hope for that.
Oh.
I just did want to pick up something you said, Alex, about the clerk of works. I mean, it seems to me that that's the retrofit coordinator. The retrofit coordinator was always intended to reproduce the role of the clerk of works, hence the idea that they should work for the client. And it should be the retrofit coordinator who's learning from one project and applying that learning to the next one and the next one. And our vision was that in larger housing organizations there'd be a team of retrofit coordinators who looked after their programs, and they swapped experience and knowledge and supported each other, and perhaps even became a bit specialist. Somebody knows a lot about EWI and somebody else knows a lot about heat pumps or whatever it might be. We're not quite there yet, because people are still saying, well, this retrofit coordinator is a bit of a pain, we've got to employ them, they're a bit expensive, what are we going to do with them? Instead of treating them as an asset, they're there to protect the client's interests. And therefore they are, I mean, essentially we call them retrofit coordinators, but they're really trying to when the retrofit coordinator was invented, which was by Mark Elton and Bob Pruitt in the days before we had even had core. Actually, the idea was that it was a sort of value-added role for the architect. Something that local architects could do to give extra value to their clients. And so it was always seen as a sort of new type of clerk of works after we abandoned clerks of works. And I'm hoping that we do get back to that our retrofit specialists have got to be in a position where everybody, contractors, consultants and clients and householders can benefit from their experience, that they're supposed to know what good looks like and help the rest of us get there.
I think one of the things you were talking about, career progression and helping people kind of see a career path. I mean, certainly retrofit coordinators, I think either as a membership of the Institution of Clerk of Works or RICS would be quite a nice thing if there was a clear path of perhaps you start out as a retrofit assessor and you kind of do a year or two of that, and then you build up and you go and do some day release or whatever, and then allow you to become a full member of RICS. But perhaps a subdivision of RICS that is just all about retrofit, then you could probably build a career, and that people can kind of say, well, actually that would be quite interesting. And for me, some of the best old clerks of works that we used to come across when we were kids would be the old boys that used to be on the tools and then decided that their knees had packed up or whatever, but they had lots of experience to hand over, and they were sticklers, and that's a really good thing for quality. And it's got to be we have to do, as everyone keeps saying, we can only afford to do this the once. And so making sure that the quality is there and encouraging that quality is paramount. And so, I just think there's some opportunities probably to be talking to RICS or, as I say, the Institute of Clerk of Works, to say, well, is there an opportunity to kind of create a path where there wasn't one before in terms of career?
There are people thinking about that. The CITB in particular have been thinking about it, but it's not hasn't been going very well anywhere recently. One of the things we've been doing in Savills with such a big program is we've been thinking about senior retrofit coordinators and specialist retrofit coordinators. And so building the team and differentiating it in such a way that we can kind of consolidate people's expertise in some areas, and hopefully people in one category will aspire to be in the other category or in the next category, and we can build so they can build their own routes. With a bit of luck, that might happen.
Yeah.
Very good. So, Alex, I was right in saying your role was more of a retrofit coordinator employed by Clarion.
And
designer, perhaps.
Well, I would like to perhaps put my role as a bit more of kind of just helping the whole team deliver from a client perspective, just encouraging. And I'm lucky enough to have done sort of Passive House and also a member of the Institute of Clerk Works, and was involved with Goldsmith Street, which is a particularly large Passive House project here in Norwich. So it was just about, Clarion were quite keen just to bring in, and I do try genuinely to think that consultants need to be made redundant, ideally. But I was brought in to kind of just act as a consultant, just to try and help the supply team, the supply chain, to come up with the goods. So I saw my role as perhaps just asking lots of questions, trying to encourage people to sort of go away and think about things. So I didn't have a formal role because we, Instagroup, were doing the retrofit coordinator, and obviously Danielle, you've got the retrofit assessors within your team. So it was just more of perhaps giving confidence from the client perspective that their team on the other side of the fence, if you will, were kind of willing and able to do what was required. And also for all of us, the whole industry, it was about learning about PAS 2035 as well. I mean, let's not make any bones about it. We were all sort of kind of feeling around in the dark a little bit, and so there was just trying to bring in a little bit of expertise. I'm a very sad, geeky person that spent years in concrete, so it was really nice working with no flames concrete houses. So I used to be able to pick on people talking about the concrete repairs that were required on some of the buildings. I'm a Passive House guy, so I'm quite happy looking at thermal bridging and all that sort of stuff, and air tightness. So it was perhaps a golden project for me as an individual to apply all of my 20 odd years of experience into helping deliver a project. But it wouldn't have been delivered without the rest of the team. I was literally a team member. I wasn't a key part of it. I just felt that there was an opportunity to try and get the best out of a project, and I hope that I gave value to the client, and I hope that the supply chain didn't get completely fed up with me.
I think what you said, Alex, about getting rid of the professionals is, there's a lot in that. One of the things we've been doing in Savills is trying to see how much of those roles we can automate. Because I think one of the lessons about PAS 2035 so far is that the role of the retrofit coordinator is way too big. And people don't have the experience to fill it properly yet. And so what we've been saying was, well, how much of this can we do automatically? Can we generate an assessment report from the stock condition survey database? Well, yes, if the survey has been done in enough detail. Can we generate an improvement option evaluation on house types almost automatically? And can we turn that into a medium-term plan almost automatically? And then when we look at the key role is the retrofit designer. But I've come to the conclusion that getting architects who draw lots of plans is completely the wrong way to approach that. The retrofit designer is a kind of lead designer. Most retrofit measures are designed by specialist suppliers.
Correct.
They're either EWI or ventilation or heat pumps or whatever it might be. So what the retrofit designer should be doing is not sitting there with their CAD system drawing plans, but actually bringing all those strands of design together and making sure they're all joined up properly and there are no gaps.
Yes.
And what we've been doing at Savills is trying to create standard specifications and standard construction details that people can edit instead of growing everything from the ground every time.
Yes.
And I think that's probably the way forward. And we don't need it just to be a library of construction details and specs for Savills. We need it to be a national library of details and specs that everybody can buy into and editable. So that if you want a roof wall junction for EWI, you've probably got one of your own, but you can look at the national one and say, is that better than mine? Or can I modify it for this particular problem? And so I'm thinking that, I've found so far that architects make the best retrofit assessors, retrofit coordinators, and retrofit designers, but we don't want them to do what they normally do as architects. We want them to use their knowledge and experience and do something that's quite a bit different. And I think that's going to take a while to bed in. And, you know, every time I see someone drawing a plan, I think, why do we need a plan? You know?
Well, because
I really agree with that, though. I do really agree with that in terms of the full drawings and the full specifications, because we do already have them for our specific systems. And I would go to Vince and ask him for a set of drawings for the MEV systems that we're installing, and I would go to Stowe and Insta and get them. And then we've had an architect to essentially redraw all of that. Now, how I use my retrofit designers on other projects is I send them all of those specifications, I send them our technical drawings and our proposed measures, and from that they can essentially design a package that they're comfortable with. They highlight any risks, they tell me what they would like to see in addition, or what we're potentially doing that doesn't need to be done, and then that becomes our final scope of works, if you like. But it cuts out these thousands of pounds worth of drawings and site visits. And certainly some of the projects that we're working on, again in London, every single property we go to is different. There is no uniformity because they're all built very, very differently. Some have had extensions, some have got bay windows, whatever it may be. So this sort of generic set of templates makes life a lot easier, because certainly, and I think Alex sort of sold himself a little bit short. For us as an installer getting involved in this project, and we were involved in it not just as putting insulation on the wall, we were also the retrofit assessor. We were doing lots of different bits throughout and trying to handhold different people through the process. We were doing the ventilation, the solar, a whole host of works. And for us, when we sat down for the first meeting and started talking about this new funding, this social decarbonisation, and I'm someone that's proactive in the industry and engaged within the industry, and I came off of that meeting thinking, oh, I'm out of my depth here. This is going to be too much. It appeared to be too much, and we were working to PAS 2035 already. We were already in that world, but I came off of that first meeting thinking this is a headache. This is a headache waiting to happen. But actually, we had Alex there that we could bounce ideas off and that would tell us, quite frankly, if we were doing something wrong or if we had a better idea. We had a large team of people involved in all of these decisions. As Alex said, the manufacturers were in there from the beginning. And actually, by the end of those sort of first phase of meetings, it became very apparent this is just another project to insulate or put solar on a roof. It's just that we're looking at it through a microscope. And I think this is something that, going back to education, a lot of my colleagues in this industry that have external wall insulation companies, for example, and are PAS approved, aren't going anywhere near social decarbonisation because they're scared of it, because it looks a lot, it seems a lot more complex. But actually, when you get to the nitty gritty, it's just the same as everything else. As long as you've got those other people there that you need on the team, whether that be an architect, the assessors, the coordinators. And I think we've really got to push that message out there. And I certainly have been trying to convince my colleagues to go forward for some of this work, because there is too much to be delivered at the moment. And we've got to take the scariness out of it. And for us, having Alex was sort of the academic of the group, the scientist of the group, if you like.
Thank you.
That's certainly how we saw him, is that if something seemed a little bit too confusing, Alex would come and put it in layman's terms for us, and it was stuff that we can understand. It's just not terminology that we're necessarily used to, because it's not terminology we've had to be used to before in delivering these schemes. And I think we need to do that. We need to simplify, we need to educate, and we need to communicate so that more people that are already existing within the industry buy into deep retrofit. And hopefully then we won't see some of these other skill shortages issues that are existing, because there are people there.
Yeah, well, that's very kind of you, Danielle. Thank you. But I think I can't emphasize enough, it's skill and knowledge are key elements that as an industry we struggle with, and part of that goes right back to what we said earlier on, that we're not really getting the quality of kids coming through, if I'm being brutally honest. How many A-level students with 3 or 4 good A-levels want to go and do a civil engineering degree? Probably not that many. And until as a society we value engineers in a way that we just do not value, we are always going to struggle. So I've always said if I was dictator, the first thing that I would implement is I'd make it illegal to call yourself an engineer unless you were a chartered member of an engineering place. As a kid, I lived with a load of mechanical engineers. And I remember the washing machine packed up in the student house, and they rang Hotpoint, I think it was, and they said, "Oh, we'll send out an engineer." To which the lad on the phone said, "Oh, tell me, what degree does he have?" And then they went, "Well, he hasn't got a degree." "Oh, you mean a technician's going to come on?" And so they literally, but we do not value the word engineer. And I think that would be a really good starting point to make sure that as a country, we value the different trades and skills that are out there and not allowing to make it a bit differential, to encourage it. Germany, if you're an ING, you are something important. Here, having a chartered membership of it as an engineering is neither here nor there. It doesn't have any value. Everybody wants to be a lawyer or some other kind of stuff that's not particularly useful to humanity. I'm going to get sued now by the whole of the legal profession. But I just think it would be a really good starting point, and that would encourage people to come into all the engineering professions, and hopefully, some of them would come off into building and civil engineering, and increase the ability and the brain power of the whole industry. I mean, there are some fantastic individuals out there, but I just probably guess that we're not necessarily garnering a fair share of brains and brawn. I think we're getting the brawn, but there's probably a little bit more brains available out there, and it'd be great to have that within the industry for us all.
But Alex, I think if it becomes a 625 billion 28-year program to retrofit the housing stock, that will attract lots of people. The whole sniff of it will, at every level.
I think it's a class thing. It'd be nice to live in a classless society, but if I said, when I told my mum I was going to do a civil engineering degree, bearing in mind that we live near Tunbridge Wells, her face visibly dropped. It was like as though I had told her that I'd given, I had a girlfriend and she'd just given birth to triplets. Aged 18. So I think until we value engineers, really good, skilled people in a way that we do not as a society, I think we're always going to struggle. And wouldn't it be great to say, "Hey, Mum, I've got a career as a retrofit assessor," and it'd be, "Yeah, that's fantastic," or "I've got a job in insulating 500 houses over the next couple of years, and I'm really excited about doing it to a really nice standard, and all these people are going to save loads of energy." And we don't, you're not going to, just after the pandemic, nurses and doctors and that would sort of go out for a group night, and people were buying them drinks. If there's a group of wall insulators go into a pub, how often do they get a drink bought for them? But what they're doing is vitally important, and that's the way to think about it. We need to change our attitude. I mean, some of the tenants that we dealt with, Danielle, they were not visibly moved, but they were really, really pleased that we'd come along and made a difference to their lives. And for me, as an individual, that added so much value to what we were doing, that people were making a point of coming out on their doorsteps and saying, my gas bill has gone from 30 quid a week to 10 or whatever it was. There were some fantastic numbers of individuals saying my prepay meter is brilliant. And so they're definitely deserving of a pint down the pub, I think, as a sector. But we need to get there in terms of societal attitudes to our industry, and we're a million miles from there yet.
It reminds me of the Arc B chapter in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they discover this huge spaceship going off into the middle of nowhere, full of frozen people being emigrating, and it turns out that it's Arc B because they're being sent just anywhere because it's full of telephone sanitizers and people like that, and Arc A has got all the really useful people, and that's going somewhere else.
I like that idea a lot. Dear.
I think there's a sort of one thing I wanted to say as we I suppose we're beginning to come to the end here, but one of the things I've been doing recently is going around a lot of city centre areas and finding a lot of places where some retrofit's been done sometime in the last 10 years ago or so. And one of the things I've learned, which I learned really from Preston, amongst other things, before each home counts, but has been reinforced for me is that we only get one shot at this. There isn't the time or the money to go around again.
Yep.
And getting it wrong is a total disaster.
Yes.
You know, it costs 5 times as much, and it takes 5, 6, 7 years to put things right, as we've seen in Preston. I was in a city in the northeast, I won't name it, recently, looking at a central estate that had been EWI'd about 10, 12 years ago by somebody who was no doubt well motivated. And the houses are, it was done really badly, and the houses are absolutely dreadful, and they're just damp and moldy and horrible inside, and damp and moldy and horrible outside. And actually the ones they didn't do are much nicer houses. The architecture's still there. They're cold, but they're dry. And so that kind of reinforced for me the need to make sure that we, you know, this whole effort that we've all been talking about is actually focused on doing it well.
Yes.
And we get one chance. And if we get it wrong, we'll be nowhere in 2050.
Yes. Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, wholeheartedly with that. And that goes, as I said, that just reinforces the idea of good skills, because you can't monitor every single guy on the tools all the time. So the quality has to start with the boots and work its way up the chain, as well, as much as somebody coming around with a clipboard and ticking off going, oh yeah, that's really nice. It actually needs to be that people just know exactly what to do to a really good standard, and they can consistently do it day in, day out, probably without a lot of sort of management, kind of hovering over them, because it's just not going to be available.
Well, we've got to trust people, haven't we? And
precisely.
I think it's also about weeding out the people who just want to do the absolute minimum they can get away with, and forget the quality. And there are quite a lot of those people in the industry, and I'm sure Danielle encounters them. And it's very important that we get rid of those people or re-educate them or something, because there isn't room for them.
No.
And that's quite a difficult thing to say and to do, but we have to find a way. I think the Grenfell inquiry really brought that out, that it's not just installers and operatives on site, it's suppliers and product companies and testing companies. The culture of cheating things, let's get it by if we can, is very well embedded in some bits of the industry. And it's driven probably by, we buy everything as cheaply as we can, and somehow or other we've got to counter that and push back and say it's more important we get it right than we get it as cheap as possible.
Yes.
Once again, I would like to thank Alex Honey, Danielle Belton, and Peter Rickaby. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show and listening to your views as